James Campion on the telephone with us. How are things up in Newark, New Jersey?
Well, I'm a little north of Newark. I'm in the mountains here where the black bear run free and the wild turkey eat all of our bird feed. So it's a little north of that. I'm only about 32 miles or 28, 30 miles from New York City, but it's a completely different milieu here. It's unbelievable. But thank you. It's very cold. Very cold here.
It is here, too. Hey, you wrote a book called Shout It Out Loud, The Story of Kiss's Destroyer and the Making of an American Icon. This is all about the fourth studio album of Kiss, and it's called Destroyer. I enjoyed the book immensely. I'm not just saying that. This isn't a fanboy piece that you wrote. It's tremendously researched to the point where I've got to ask you, James, are you an academic?
No, but thank you. I appreciate that. I'll take that title. Thank you very much. No, Joe, I'm a journalist. And, in my experience of working on anything, research is king. There's no way you can get around it. It's a pay me now, pay me later deal. So you don't want to leave any stone unturned. And specifically with something in the pop culture like Kiss, I liken Kiss fans to, say, Star Trek fans or Star Wars fans or baseball fans who know every inside out. And I've covered pop culture, sports, politics, social issues, and thus. But when you start getting into the weeds with these kind of pop culture icons, as I mentioned in the book and in the title, and specifically one record, you really, really have to. I didn't want to leave any stone unturned, so I thank you very much for that. And I tried to write an academic book. I wanted something that had an intellectual treatise for something that is normally treated like fluff. And I thought Kiss got the short shrift over the years. They were ignored for the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and I wrote a piece for the Huffington Post back in 2011 when I found out they weren't. And that sort of gave me the impetus to do the book because I got so much feedback. People like, you're right. And, why are they, that I thought that anything lowbrow art or what is considered pop art or big pop culture, and Kiss fits into that, especially in the 1970s, that it deserved that type of introspection. So I really appreciate you giving me feedback in that direction.
And what's nice about your writing, even though it is well-researched and leans academic, it's not bulletproof. Anyone can read it. It's not so academic that the average person can't read and enjoy it.
I appreciate that. I made it accessible. I usually write for my wife because a lot of the things that are very interesting to me are not so much to her. She loves to read, but she didn't really care at all about Kiss, knew anything about it. So I always keep her in mind to say, will she find this too thick, or will she get lost here, or will she be bored? And then so it's very important. I like that as a feedback, use her as a sounding board. And I always think in terms of that when I write my stuff, because if you're going to write about a subject and you're trying to make a point in it, and there's definitely a thesis to this book that I wanted to make sure that someone who does not follow the genre or doesn't care specifically about the subject can still get enough out of it and maybe be swayed to my way of thinking. So that was also a theme or a goal of mine with this.
Before I start picking specific things out of the book, let's talk just general about Kiss. Why this foursome in kabuki makeup? Why did this group rocket to such stardom? It states at the beginning of chapter 3. You quote one of Kiss's members. I think the lead singer. Didn't you hear we're the clowns of rock and roll?
Yeah.
I mean, why are they so popular? It seems almost a joke.
Well, let's go back to the 1970s. I mean, the answer to that is twofold. Number one, the period. Very, very experimental period. Sadly found out this morning that David Bowie passed, who is one of the godfathers of that creative environment, the glam rock period. Kiss was at the very butt end of that. They weren't going for that. As the great Bob Gruen, famous photographer of rock and punk, told me when I interviewed him for the book, Kiss was trying to be like the New York Dolls, but they weren't pretty boys. They didn't dress up like Bowie and give you this androgynous style. They were big, strong, hairy guys, and so they started to create these monster characters, these otherworldly characters. So this was part, and of course Alice Cooper, which I dedicate to chapters of the book to, specifically because of their producer, Bob Ezrin, who worked on this record. But the idea of creating characters, creating themes, and then expressing those themes almost as librettos for a play or a musical or an opera, they would bring this out to whatever that, again, the milieu is for that particular time. So without the 1970s, you don't get Kiss. Number two, Kiss was, those four guys were very unique, and especially Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons, the two main guys who are still going to this day with the band. And that's Paul Stanley's quote that you quoted there from the beginning of the third chapter. They understood the humor in it. They understood the theatrics of it. And they also understood the fact that they couldn't be pigeonholed the way the New York Dolls were in the 70s, that sort of New York feel. They wanted to go beyond that. They wanted to be arena. So from the very beginning, they depicted themselves, and I call it in the book the act, capital T, capital A, as this bigger, larger-than-life thing, even when they had no fan base, no money. Their management was just, scrimping and stealing and borrowing just to get them through. Their record company was just beginning. So it really is an amazing story about how they went beyond it. But none of this happens. None of it happens without the 1970s environment, and that was an experimental, amazing period where so many different disparate musical styles came out of, and Kiss really, really absorbed into that, and they catapulted from there. And I make the argument that without Destroyer, they don't get to be that iconic character. They were kind of floundering around as this sort of rock oddity with the makeup, but they didn't really achieve the kind of status that they have achieved in American pop culture until the making of this record.
And I got from the early parts of the book that Destroyer had absolutely every chance to fail because they had just come out with a live album, and every single critique was that, no, this isn't going to work. Kiss is a live band. They're Kiss Alive. That's what you need to hear. A studio album just isn't going to work, and when it first came out, it received horrible critical reviews. This thing had every right to fail, yet it succeeded. Why do you think it succeeded? I know I'm asking you an overriding question, but this thing had every right to fail, but it didn't.
Yeah, and it's an excellent question. It's one I hope I answered in the book. But the short there, as best I can, is that it was in and of its time. It was shocking, and normally something in the culture, whatever culture that will be, but let's just keep it in rock for now, hard rock in the 70s. Anything that really shakes the foundations at first is never taken well. I'll give you an example. What's considered now arguably the greatest rock and roll record ever, Exile on Main Street, was lambasted, completely vilified. It was so badly vilified that Rolling Stone magazine actually ran two reviews. One when it came out in the summer or spring of 1972, and then about 4 months later when everyone came to, they had their come to Jesus moment and realized that this thing was a masterpiece by the Rolling Stones. This is true of the Ziggy Stardust record. If you read the early reviews of Rise and Fall of Ziggy Stardust, speaking of Bowie, that also, where is this guy going? What is this ridiculousness? Very true of Tommy by The Who. And I'm not putting Destroyer in that category per se, but what I'm saying is, in the canon of Kiss, everybody expected 4 chords, chanting vocals, songs about sex, songs about youth, songs about this and that. And those are all in Destroyer, but there was something that Bob Ezrin did with them to give them a pathos to this ethos that they built, this idea of youth and power and theatrics. So I guess this is a little longer than I wanted to answer, but it was the perfect vehicle for them to represent what they wanted to represent. In their first 3 studio albums, they're basically rock albums, not really that hard, kind of. They have a little bit of poppiness to them. They threw the 4 faces on the cover, but they didn't create this underlying image that you see in Destroyer. I think later on, and the album sold very well, it just sort of dove off the charts, and people's reaction, specifically the rock press like Circus Magazine and Cream, and the fans, why are there strings on this? A calliope, a choir, what acoustic guitars, pianos, a ballad. So there was an immediate reaction of, what is this? that ended up later on. Now it's considered their finest record, and it's put in the, just like these other ones. So the shock value of it, I think, is what kind of threw people away. And as you said, it could have easily failed. And then, of course, Beth became a huge single, which brought the record back into the charts and really cemented Kiss as an international act.
Now, Kiss, their first album, Hotter Than Hell, also their second album, was produced by Kenny Kerner and Richie Wise, who, I'll be honest with you, I don't have the slightest idea who they are. Dressed to Kill, their third album, was produced by Casablanca president and disco hero Neil Bogart. That was a mistake out of the box. Right. However, this album, Destroyer, was produced by Bob Ezrin, which, and again, this is an undertow in the book, you give the impression that that made all the difference. He sent them to boot camp. Who is Bob Ezrin, and what effect did he have on the album?
Well, everything that Robert Allen Ezrin has done in his career has completely shifted the paradigm for whatever act he worked with. He's famous for building Alice Cooper. I mean, Alice, who I interview for the book, and I have done several pieces about over the years, one of the nicest people I ever want to meet, and a guy who's very honest and extremely introspective about the character he created, and the effect it had, not only on the culture there, but how he used burlesque and sort of a Charlie Chaplin idea of building a character and then making it of its time. That's Bob Ezrin with Alice. Bob got in the studio with the Alice Cooper Group, who had two really bad psychedelic albums working with Frank Zappa on his straight label in the late 60s, and got together with them and created songs. And those songs had images. There was never just a love song with Alice Cooper. It was the deviance of love. It wasn't just commenting on social issues with Alice Cooper. It was the underbelly of America, the greed of America in the 70s, this idea of us not trusting our institutions, Nixon, the idea of cults that became very big in the 1970s. Bob, who's a Canadian, interestingly enough, tapped in to the Americana of it all. McDonald's, blockbusters, all those things that kind of just blew up in the 1970s. And so he created that with Alice, and Alice is very effusive about it in many, many different aspects. For 5 or 6 albums, he created this myth of Alice Cooper in a musical sense. And when Kiss was just beginning in 1973, Alice Cooper was the biggest rock band on the planet. They had the #1 album in the UK and America at the same time, Billion Dollar Babies. Their tour broke every record, and Rolling Stones, Elvis Presley, all over the world. And so Bob was riding high, 25, 26 years old. And when Kiss went to get him, he brought that kind of idea to them, which they needed desperately. As you mentioned, Kerner and Wise were producers of Badfinger, which was just an offshoot of a Beatlesque sort of poppy thing. Bogart, who was stoned the entire time he was producing it. As you said, he's a bubble gum. He built a bubble gum label in Kama Sutra Records and Buddha, and then he worked with. And then later on worked with Donna Summer and everything. So that was, ill-fated. But Bob was the perfect guy for that. And then Ezrin went on to produce the very first Peter Gabriel album, which launched Peter Gabriel again as this sort of theatrical. He was that way with Genesis, but, Gabriel needed to get kind of rebuilt there when he left Genesis. And here comes Bob Ezrin, who produces his first album. And then, of course, arguably maybe his greatest triumph is Pink Floyd's The Wall, which to this day is still one of the great conceptual pieces ever. And then he went on to produce many other bands in the years after that. But Bob Ezrin was many things. He was cinematic. He always had this idea of what the record should be, what the band should represent, how each song should be part of a grander theme in the albums, which he did with Alice Cooper and, of course, with The Wall. And he was very, 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 very talented musically. There was nothing that Bob couldn't do. He could play the bass, he could play the drums, the piano certainly. He can arrange strings, bring different instruments in. So he was really a Svengali for the band. And he brought them back into boot camp when he said, let's do something in 7/4 time. They all looked at him like he had, 3 heads. Let's play some ninth chords over this so we can have some harmonies. What are you talking about, ninth? So he finally said, forget it. I'm bringing out the blackboard, and we're going to go back to basics. And he helped Kiss become a musical outfit that they were missing in those earlier records. But I think the most important thing he did with them is he understood that they were a theatrical band They had not tapped into that yet, and he forced them to do it and face it, and Destroyer is their masterpiece because of it.
Now, if you're a sound nerd, I mean, if you really like the concept of microphone placement and how things are recorded, chapters 14 and 19 are going to be for you. It explains exactly how the album is recorded, right down to almost the placement of items. I mean, you even go as far as stating exactly what microphone is used. And I found those very interesting. I have a little studio at my house and have two of the microphones that were used to record the album. Can you isolate it? Can you sort of say this technique that Ezrin used was what made this album? Because, I mean, I have two of the first Kiss albums, and they don't sound like Destroyer. It's so much fuller. It's so much fatter. It's so much bigger in your speakers. What was it about the recording of this album that was so much more than the first three?
Well, you hit it right on the nose, Joe. Right on the nose. That's one of the things that fascinated me as a kid. I was 13 when I first heard it, and it stayed with me my whole life, and I debated many times in symposiums and arguments with other rock journalists or making lists that this belongs in the pantheon of the great rock 70s albums just because of that. The reason why, there's several. Number one, they recorded it at the record plant, which was the state-of-the-art record plant east on West 44th Street, which is gone now, which made doing research for this very difficult because there were no records left. So the record plant was, like I said, Studio A, where just hundreds of great records were recorded. So that's number one. Number two, almost everybody that worked at the record plant, two of which engineered this record, Jay Messina and Corky Stasiak, the engineer and assistant engineer, respectively. These two gentlemen had worked with just about everybody, from Alice Cooper, Aerosmith, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, worked on the Woodstock soundtrack, the Bangladesh soundtrack, worked at movie soundtracks, did every style of music you could probably, Ravi Shankar. So these guys knew what they were doing in a big way. They talk, like you said, the slightest details of how they recorded records back then. And it's interesting because since I interviewed a lot of the guys for the old guys that worked at the record plant and people that work today with music, as you know, Joe, Pro Tools and these type of things, you could record great stuff right in your living room. In those days, you had to go to a studio, and it was an art form. You had to have the mics, and the mics had to be in the exact same spot. The difference between having a microphone a foot from an amp, 2 feet just to the side of an amp, the way the amp is cranked or not cranked, where you put the amp in the room, the drum specifically because it's an acoustic instrument. On Destroyer, they put it on cement, they put it on a rug, half on cement, half on a rug, with baffles, without baffles, in a dead room to get a dead sound for one of the songs. They actually put the tom-toms in an elevator shaft and had Peter Criss play there to give it that booming sound. So Bob, again, as I said earlier, he was building a theatrical presentation. The first 3 records are rock records. They could be anything from The Sweep to Bay City Rollers to Black Sabbath. There was nothing really, there was no main theme or image to it. Bob knew exactly what he wanted to do, and I think it's the biggest, largest, wettest, most effusive and imaginative, cinematic-sounding record that he did. I think the only ones that come close definitely is Pink Floyd The Wall, because if you listen to that, the boomingness of it just takes over the speakers and takes over your headphones. And Billion Dollar Babies, which he had just recorded prior to the Alice Cooper band breaking up. Those 3 records, if you listen to them back to back to back, and I challenge all the listeners to do so, you really get the feeling of exactly where Bob was at that time. And it was perfect, again, for the 1970s. We wanted our stuff big and loud and crazy. It was over the top, concept albums and big sounds and big studios. So that album really does fit right into that area. But that's a great observation on your part, Joe, because that record really does sort of echo. It's almost like you are in a theater. They were always searching for that. Let's capture the live sound. And as Corky Stasiak, the assistant engineer, said, I don't think they ever did come close to it again. Only on Destroyer did they actually nail that.
Many people are of the opinion Gene Simmons was always the driving force behind Kiss, and he is, even today. Tell me who Bill Aucoin is.
Bill Aucoin was their first manager. He discovered them, no question about it. They were playing these little showcases in New York in these dives, these horrible places. And Bill came out. They would send these notes out to all these record type people. And Bill, the interesting thing about Bill is when he showed up to see Kiss, he really wasn't even looking really to manage a band. He was just looking for different things to make money that he thought would fit into something he can use. He had a great background in advertising. He had his own video and television production company called Direction Plus, which worked in the same building on Madison Avenue in New York with the Howard Marks agency, which was an advertising and marketing agency. They had their own graphic people there. They had their own, like I said, videographers there and everything else. So Bill already had that under his belt. So when he saw Kiss, obviously, he saw dollar signs. But he saw that they were very raw. They were just up there with the makeup and the leather outfits, and although they had the great visuals going and the music was okay, he really saw it as something that he can build and decide. So Gene Simmons is quoted in the book as saying 90% of what Kiss came out of Bill's head. He immediately got Sean Delaney, his partner, and at that time his lover, to work with them. Sean had a background in Broadway and theatrics, and he got them on stage, dyed all their hair blue-black, sent them down to the East Village to get S&M equipment and clothes and leather and dog collars and all these things to create this image. They work with them on the stage. They use the film and the video cameras to videotape their shows. So Gene had to be the demon and Paul had to be the lover and Ace had to wobbling around in his Space Ace type thing, and Peter is pounding in the back as the Catman, and all of this stuff. Work with these guys for hours and hours and weeks, transforming them into Kiss. And I'm not saying the guys in Kiss didn't work their butts off. They did, and played to derision at the beginning and had to build an audience one gig after just driving all across the country in pickup trucks and whatever they could do. But Bill Aucoin was really the mad genius behind them. He would be like their Brian Epstein, who discovered the Beatles in the cavern and kind of told them to cut their hair a certain way and stand a certain way. And Gene Simmons says, I understood exactly what Bill was doing with us, because when I was a kid and I saw the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, they didn't just look like guys playing instruments. They looked like a band, and that's what I wanted. I wanted us to look like, if we walked in a room and I'm standing over there and there's 1,000 people in the room and Ace is on the other side, obviously if their faces are painted, you'd say they're together. But he wanted that sort of gang mentality. And Bill Aucoin saw that right away, to his credit, and he got them a record deal, as he promised them, within a couple of months. And Neil Bogart, as we mentioned earlier in the discussion, was just starting Casablanca Records, and he decided he wanted something visual. He loved the face painting. He loved the idea of it. So all these people really got behind Kiss, and because of the fact that they took any barrier and completely ignored it, that was really a perfect triumvirate. The band, Bill, and then, of course, Neil with Casablanca Records, to make Kiss, at least get Kiss to Bob Ezrin. They got them, survived through those early years to get them to Bob, and I think Bob hit it out of the park with Destroyer.
James, answer me this. Who is Kim Fowley? How does he figure into the album? If you look at the album, if you have it, you'll find the name Fowley following King of the Nighttime World and Do You Love Me? Who is Kim Fowley?
Kim Fowley was, and sadly he passed last year, and he gave one of his last long-form interviews specifically about this record. Two people had passed since I finished the book. Dick Wagner, who plays in the background on the record. We could discuss Dick later as well. They both passed, so both of them gave their last interviews about Destroyer and what they did. But Kim Fowley, you could spend... No kidding. You could spend a week reading about what Kim Fowley did in the music business from the late 1950s all the way up until he passed away. Here's a man who seems to be in everything. I've read the last two books I've read about music. Kim Fowley was in there, and when I interviewed him, which went on for about 2 hours at about 2 in the morning one time when I was working on the book, and all the other stuff I've read about Kim, He's in them. I just read a book about Van Halen. He helped Van Halen, get a studio. I read a book about the eclectic artist from Austin, Texas, Daniel Johnston, recently. And here's Kim Fowley helping Daniel Johnston. He's everywhere. He worked with everyone. He got Jimi Hendrix an apartment. He hung out with the Mamas and Papas. He started the Runaways. He got 2 songs on a Kiss album. He introduced Alice Cooper to the GTOs, who introduced them to Frank Zappa, that got them on a label. He worked with Warren Zevon when Warren Zevon was nobody. He worked on the soundtrack to American Graffiti. The guy is amazing, and he knew Bob Ezrin back in the day. And Bob told me if I wanted to know what was going on in L.A., I talked to Kim Fowley. Everybody talked to Kim Fowley. And here's Kim, has this band called the Hollywood Stars, and they've got a song called King of the Nighttime World. And the band is a mess. Yeah, they're all on drugs. They're fighting with each other, ego problems. And Kim's a nut, too. So let's face it, he probably was throwing some wrenches in this. And he played the stuff for Bob. And because Bob would do him favors, he did favors for Bob. And Bob says, I don't like this band, but I like that King of the Nighttime World. So if band ever breaks up and you want to do something with it, give me a call. So fast forward, here comes Destroyer. They're working on it. Kim had already given him a song that he'd worked on with another band for Alice Cooper's first solo album, which Bob, of course, produced. Welcome to My Nightmare in 1975. So here we are, late 1975 into 76. Kim calls him up. The Hollywood Stars are no more. What do you think of this King of the Nighttime World? Bob's like, great, bang. Gives it to Paul. They rework it a little bit. If you listen to the demo on YouTube, you can hear Kiss actually brightens the song up. Gives it a little bit more punch, and it just works beautifully on the album. And then he gave Kim to help him with the lyrics to "Do You Love Me," which is the penultimate song on the record. And certainly Kim said fine. And there's a great story in the book in which he's picking up the bass player or somebody from the Runaways at an airport, and he gets in, and Joan Jett is there, who's on the Runaways, and her mom is there, and she's like, "What are you doing writing on a napkin?" He goes, I'm working on my pension," because Kim knew if he can get a song on the Kiss record, he said that would be like getting a song on a Lady Gaga record today, that he would be set for life, and it's true. And he said he always got royalty checks from that record until the day he died, and it's a fascinating story. Kim Fowley's one of those amazing characters that find their way into the story of Destroyer. There's dozens of them, but I'm glad you asked me about Kim, because it's the first time in all the interviews I've done promoting the book that we've talked about Fowley at all, and he deserves a lot of credit for helping, again, the images that are depicted in this record.
Now, there are a lot of myths inside of rock and roll. And one of the things that always comes up that people hear about that a lot of people think is a myth is that Detroit Rock City is about some kid who died going to a Kiss concert, and it must be a myth. But what is exactly the true story behind Detroit Rock City? Is it about the death of some Kiss fan? Yes or no?
You're killing me. I'll tell you, it was the thing that pained me the most, and I know that you know this to be true because you read the book, and I have a last final afterword in there where I spent about really 6 months of my life, and I'm never getting back, looking for this alleged victim of a car accident. Now, as I mentioned earlier in the book, there is nothing more iconic in the history of rock and roll music, going all the way back to Leader of the Pack, certainly the Jan and Dean song, certainly the songs that Bruce Springsteen has written. There's no greater theme than that of the young person driving in the car and losing their lives, whatever it is, car accident, disappearing, the whole James Dean thing. This idea of connecting the car, which is one of the great icons of Americana, of America, of the 20th century, of the American century, and of course placing it in Detroit, which Paul Stanley wanted to write a song for Detroit because they embraced Kiss like no other place. I mean, this was the hotbed. This was the beginning of heavy metal, hard rock, was Detroit. So many great bands came out of there. Dick Wagner was in The Frost that came out of there, and a couple of other bands, Ted Nugent and the Amboy Dukes, Bob Seger, who's not really hard rock, but he came out of there as well. Iggy and the Stooges. Alice Cooper went there and decamped there so they can make their career. So Detroit was sort of the hotbed. So you combine this great theme and story of the American car and Detroit, where the American car was born, and then you figure this whole thing is completely made up. It's a perfect opening to this amazing record. But Paul tells a story, and he told it in several places, and he told it to me when I did an interview with him in 2006 for his solo album Live to Win, that sometime in 1974, during the first Kiss tour, he had heard, not read, because believe me, I looked at every newspaper, at every police blotter, all the way through the South. He said somewhere in the South, he thinks in Charlotte, a kid lost his life at going to a Kiss concert. He tells Ken Sharp, who I got to know and interviewed for the book, in the official Kiss biography, which is Behind the Mask from 1996, that a kid was hit by a car in the parking lot in Charlotte. The next night they played in Fayetteville, so I looked up in the Fayetteville newspapers and everything, called the police and checked the police blotters and everything, nothing. He tells a different story in another account, and then he told me that a kid died on his way to the concert. Now, if you listen to Detroit Rock City, that's the story of the kid getting in the car, and he's listening to a song, and he's playing fast, and he's high, and he's drinking, and he's screaming, and he's just youth, and he feels invincible. Then at the end of the song, of course, the brilliant car accident, the skidding of the car that Bob put in there, and the opening radio sort of drama. So that lends to the myth and the mystery. But I spent a long time looking for this person. And I've heard other people, that one of the roadies and people around the band say, oh, yeah, that happened. We definitely heard it. We were talking about it. We talked about it for weeks afterwards, how depressed they were that some young kid who was going to see Kiss lost his life or her life. And so I have in my book, in my afterward, about 7 or 8 names of people around Kiss shows from that tour that in the South that possibly could have lost their life. But there's no actual empirical evidence. There's no newspaper. There's no TV report, radio. I went crazy looking for that. I had, like I said, I had police people, had people in the archives department in Raleigh, the capital of North Carolina, helping me out. And we just could not find it. So it's still out there. And I've had 2 or 3 Detroit newspapers and magazines put out a call to fans. If you know anything about it. And the one thing that kept popping up, specifically on Facebook and social media, is that Fayetteville, North Carolina, which was the next stop in both the 74 and 75 tours, that was the town that sometime in the 90s or the early aughts, that people were talking about it or sending out messages. The kid was from here. We knew that kid. And there was actually a record. I've heard that there was a record store, which is not there anymore in Fayetteville, that had an RIP in the behind the counter. And again, it's gone. It's like all these things with this album. The studios are gone. The records are gone. This record store is gone. It's the weirdest thing. So there's no way I can answer that question. I tried, and you'll read the names in there, and you as a detective, maybe if people read the book, they'll go, okay, I think it might be. If anybody out there can answer that question, empirically, with real evidence, please, contact me or contact you, because it still eludes me to this day.
Off of that, a buddy of mine here on campus, Randy is his name, and he might be the largest Kiss fan I have ever met in my life. He has this question off of that. There's a radio newscast at the beginning of Detroit Rock City. He's heard that it's Gene's voice on the radio, and he's heard that it's Bob Ezrin's voice on the radio. Do you know?
It's Bob.
It's Bob Ezrin. Okay. Yeah. All right. There. Answer.
Because the long answer is, and I just did a podcast with Rick Stewart, who has a thing called All Access, and he was the lead of security for Kiss in 1975, early 76, and he was there for the sessions. And what happened was they figured that the record was only 32 minutes long. Excuse me. Normally a record back then had to be like 44 minutes, so they were woefully short. Kiss finished recording somewhere around the 23rd of January, 1976, 40 years ago this month. And they went right back on the road, which was their want, especially then. There was the only way they were making any money at all and paying off all their massive debts for all this theatrics that they were doing and non-record sales and royalties they were getting. There were lawsuits and everything else. That's all in the book. So they were gone. they were gone. And Bob, turned to his two engineers, Corky and Jay, and said, we need to do something about that. So that was two of my favorite things to write about in the book because they're very mysterious. The ending musical melange of sound and soundscape that Jay Messina came up with based on an old style of recording with tape loops, and this opening scenario, this little drama. And so at the record plant, they did jingles and ads. That was a huge part of their income. So they had hooked up an illegal AM signal that they could plug through a little AM radio, so the clients can hear, what their ad would sound like on a radio. And so Bob hooked up into that and literally read a newscast with an assistant or assistant's girlfriend washing the dishes. If you listen to the beginning of the record, what we're talking about here, this opening to Detroit Rock City, they used the binaural recording technique, which was basically you wore these microphones as a headset in your ears, as you would have now with the buds, like say for an iPhone or something. And the recording would have to go through the head. So you're hearing exactly the way you would hear if you were standing in the room. It's really quite eerie if you listen to it with the headphones. And so they did the whole thing, and Bob wrote it and read it. And Gene, for years, has been telling everyone else it was him, a classic Simmons. And I even got into it with Scott Ian from Anthrax, who knows Gene and worked with him. And I was like, no, Gene tells me. And I'm like, listen, go back to Gene. And so Bob said, no, I'll tell you, they were gone. We looked at the record. We said it was 32 minutes. Oh, my God, we got to put something else in here. Ezrin's classic, if you listen to The Wall and the early Alice Cooper, for putting little talking stuff and radio in the background and noises that give you idea that you're going into a room and listening to something special. So it was Bob Ezrin, and he's pretty clear about that, and I'm glad I kind of busted that myth.
There you go. Okay, we have to talk about it. Kiss is a rock band. Some people say it's a hard pop band, but the song that broke this album was Beth. It was the ballad. Beth is such a departure of what people think about Kiss, and there is this name, Stan Penridge, on this. I had no idea who Stan Penridge is, so I looked him up and then I went immediately to, the internet, looked him up, and then turned 2 pages, and then you explained who he was in the book. Okay, go ahead. Who is Stan Penridge?
He was in a band with Peter Criss, who was then Peter Criss Cola. In 1971, Peter Criss, of course, the drummer for Kiss. Peter was older than everybody else in Kiss. He was already in his late 20s when they broke. And he had been in a lot of bands, and Peter was inspired by people like Gene Krupa, and he loved big band music and doo-wop. So he was of a different generation, a little bit, and which gave them a little bit of a soulful sound, which I like, that separated them from more of the plodding heavy metal rock music from the period. And Peter was in a band called Chelsea with Stan Penridge, who was the guitar player, one of the guitar players, and then later on a band called Lips, interestingly enough, and then on to Kiss. But so Stan and Peter wrote a song called Beck in Peter's apartment, which, if you go on YouTube, is a great little ditty, a great little demo, warbly and crackling. It sounds like 3 a.m. after about 100 cigarettes. They're probably very high or hungover. It just got that great sound of a couple of guys just putting down a little 3-chord ditty. And they basically did it to make fun of another guitar player in the band, his girlfriend, who used to call all the time while they were trying to rehearse. And Stan says in my book that if you listen to it, if you try to think about what the other person's saying on the other side, it sounds like a person trying to explain, hey, I need to get back to record. You'll be fine, okay? Like his girlfriend nagging him. And even in the second verse of the original Beck is just, really a mock song. They were just busting his chops, And because Bob Ezrin is a genius, and because he had thrown out to the guys in Kiss, challenged them, I want different stuff. I want everything you've got. Well, Peter doesn't really write songs. I don't care. Give me anything you got. Well, he only has this, I don't care. So here's Gene Simmons and Peter Criss in the back seat of a limo leaving some show in Flint, Michigan or something, during the period when they're doing the boot camp we talked about. And Peter says, let me sing you this song. I got this melody. And he starts singing this. Beck, I hear you calling. And Gene's like, I like this, but why is it Beck? Was it about Jeff Beck? No, the girl's name was Becky. Okay, so they bring it to Bob, and Bob immediately hears, because this is the genius of Bob Ezrin, he immediately hears everything. He hears the strings, the piano. He hears a key change. He hears it as this soaring ballad of heartbreak and pathos. And Peter's like, okay. So Bob takes it back over a weekend and orchestrates this entire thing. Brings it back, says, is this okay? And they're like, all right. And nobody in the band thought it was going to be anything. They thought, ha, 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 this is Peter's thing. You know, he gets the best musicians in the world at the classic A&R Studios on 54th Street, which is also gone now, which is the original Columbia Studios, where Sinatra recorded all those brilliant records, and Streisand and Dylan and list is Simon and Garfunkel. They go in there, they record this massive string arrangement for it, 40-piece long, and they throw it on the album, and everybody in the band dismisses it. Even the owner of the label, Neil Bogart, who had just had a divorce with his wife, whose name is Elizabeth, and he gets mad. He says, "Why are you guys making fun of me?" And that had nothing to do with your wife. So every possible way to stop this thing from being a hit. If it wasn't for the great Scott Shannon, who's still a radio DJ today for WCBS in New York, who's in every radio Hall of Fame there is. I mean, Scott Shannon's one of the greats. At that time, he was working as PR and doing different things in the business, and Casablanca wooed him with a car and everything else to get him in, and they said, do us one thing, only one thing you got to do. You got to break Kiss into the mainstream. And he came back and he said, the ballad's the only way to do it. And they're like, what? No way. They're not going to go for this. So surreptitiously, he got somebody to put it on the A side. He sent it out to all his buddies in Boston and in the South, and they started playing it. And nobody knew it was Kiss, right? It's a ballad. And it started to move and move and move. It's an organic, wonderful grassroots way of a hit becoming a hit in the 70s. And it moved up slowly, and it brought the record back into the charts. And it's the highest charting single in the history of Kiss in all these years they've been around. I think it got to number 7 on the charts that late summer. And it's an amazing story, all from this little ditty with Stan Penridge and Peter on the bongos at probably 2 a.m. in his apartment in 1971. It's really an amazing story.
No kidding. Okay, I will tell you that when I'm about 3/4 of the way through the book, maybe a little less, a very poor picture of Ace Frehley starts to be painted to the point where, exit Ace Frehley, enter Dick Wagner. If you could, A, tell us who Dick Wagner is, and then second, what was going on with Ace Frehley? There's an album, or a song on the album called Sweet Pain, where there's supposed to be a lead guitar part by Ace Frehley. It's not played by Ace Frehley. It's played by Dick Wagner, and again, he's not there because of a pretty poor picture painted all around him. Tell us the story behind that.
Well, I do want to say that Bob Ezrin, one of the great things, and he was, obviously, I'm talking effusively about Bob, but he was my Wizard of Oz. I mean, it took me about 16 months to finally get Bob to sit down and talk, and then we spent hours talking about this record. He was extremely honest and forthcoming about that. There's many stories about how him and Ace didn't get along. He ended up producing another record for Kiss in 1981 in which Ace didn't show up at all. He recorded all his stuff from his home studio. So it's out there that Ace did not respond well to Bob's tough love or his get this done, get it done now, get it done right idea. Ace would just come in, usually in Kiss albums. They'd play him the 8 bars that he needed to lead, and he would lead. And he was brilliant. He was arguably the best musician in the band. But Ace was also deeply into substance abuse at the time. He was introduced to cocaine on this record. Bob, at the time, admitted that he had the 3 C's, as Paul Stanley calls it: cognac, cigars, and cocaine. And they were ubiquitous during the making of this record. So here's Ace. He's already got an alcohol problem and other issues. But Bob says it's none of that. Ace's older brother was a classical guitar player, and Ace always felt a little intimidated by that. Now here he comes, and he's playing, and the producer is classically trained and is not going to fall for any shenanigans of showing up and just winging it. He had everything planned out. The famous solo, which Ace Frehley admits in his memoirs, the greatest thing he probably ever played on a Kiss record, was written by Bob on the piano and hummed to both he and Paul, and said, "This is we're going to do that middle, what I call the aria part of the song, where it just kind of takes off, and you could tell this is not just a rock song. This is a song about a kid who's going to lose his life." And so Bob had that in there. And so Ace sort of wilted under that. And Bob says it really wasn't the drugs. It wasn't his flippant attitude. There's a myth that Gene says in his memoir, and I've heard this many times before. Ace couldn't be bothered. He's playing cards. That's not true. According to Bob and other witnesses at the time, Ace just could not handle being pressured, and he even admits it. And he just got scared. He just said, I can't do this, and just stopped showing up. And Bob at the time was like, we've got 3 weeks to get this record down. And so he would call Dick Wagner, who was at the time was living in an apartment, classic rock and roll life, had his own suite at the Plaza, grabbed his SG, his Gibson SG and his Les Paul, got in a cab and went to the record plant on 44th. Now, Dick Wagner is probably, arguably, I would say, the equivalent to what Eric Clapton was, not as big, obviously, in England. He was considered the guitar player's guitar player. Everybody wanted Dick Wagner in the band. Everybody wanted to work with Dick Wagner. He was an amazing musician back in the early 70s when, like I said, Detroit was the hotbed of rock music. Alice Cooper says at the beginning of Dick's memoir, he's the guitar player we all wanted to steal, and I knew I wanted to steal him, and he did eventually. And Dick was not just a great guitar player, he was a songwriter. He wrote Only Women Bleed. He wrote You and Me. Remember that song, You and Me, We're No Superstar? Big hit in the 70s with Alice Cooper. He was the musical director for Welcome to My Nightmare. So Bob appreciated that because Bob's a great musician, and so is Dick. And Bob used him as executive producer on the second Aerosmith record as he filled in for Joe Perry on that record without any credit. He played on several Alice Cooper records when those guys were too drunk to make it, guitar, and he came in and played on 4 tracks on Destroyer. And for the first time, and the last time, sadly, because it was the last time Dick would give an interview like this before he passed in 2014, that he played on this record in the background. And I'll let the readers find out which songs. But, yeah, he was called in to sort of pinch hit. And to Dick's credit, he came in, he got paid, he got his union pay, and he got whatever else on top of it, and went along his business. I call him the invisible virtuoso. It was a moniker that he embraced later in life, and I'm very happy to say that. And played one time Steven Tyler in front of all of Dick's kids backstage at one of the concerts in the 90s. Steven Tyler, lead singer of Aerosmith, grabbed Dick, and he said to a whole room full of people, and Dick said this is one of the proudest moments of my life, he said, this man helped us sell millions of records. And that's the kind of story, again, that's in Destroyer, these Kim Fowley stories, these background stories of people who came in. But Dick came in and he pinch hit for Ace and did a brilliant job. And to Ace's credit over the years, he always said, I was really angry at that when it first came out, but I understood where Bob was going. And if you listen to Dick's style, it's very much in that Ezrin style of thematic and cinematic. So he was the perfect anecdote to what really could have been a disaster for them during this recording of that record.
Let me give you one more question from my friend Randy, who is, again, the biggest Kiss fan I know. He's got a license plate that says Kiss. He waited for years for that to come free so he could grab it. This is all he wrote. Ready?
Yeah.
Great Expectations. What in the world were they thinking?
He's about the 10th person now that has asked that in the exact same way. As I said throughout this discussion, it's Bob Ezrin. It's also Gene Simmons. Gene Simmons considered himself a Beatle-esque type songwriter. When they did their 4 solo records, if you listen to Gene Simmons' record, 2 or 3 of those songs could easily be like early 1960s Beatles songs. But because they were a hard rock band and he was the demon, he had to write certain songs a certain way. And, it always came from Gene as salacious, or he's the Lothario, or, the womanizer, or the like I said, the demon. His songs, War Machine, and all these songs that he had, Larger Than Life. At his heart, he really loved the Beatles, and he loved to write like that. And so he had a song that was sort of Beatlesque. And Bob saw the musical worth of it. And he said, nothing, like I said with Beth, nothing's left out in this project. Everything gets considered. And Bob was laughing when he told me the story, but he said, I immediately heard and lifted Beethoven's Pathétique, the sonata, the piano sonata, for the beginning of it. And he laughed to this day. He said, I can't believe, it's just unbelievable that no one would see that. But what Kiss fan is going to know about Beethoven? And so once he had incorporated that piano part into into Gene's Beatlesque sort of song, and let's face it, the Beatles did move the needle as far as experimentation and bringing classical music into their work, that Isrin created this thing, and then of course they went nuts. They when they booked the string, they booked A&R Studios to do the strings for Beth. They brought in a choir, the Brooklyn Boys Choir, and they sang it, and Bob dressed them up in dashikis, and they all put top hats and black tie and tails, and they did it up. The photographers came and took photographs of the band in their new costumes. So it was this big event, and so yeah, that's just Bob, as he says in my book. It's my P.T. Barnum coming out. I couldn't help myself, and of course, Kiss was that too. So they sort of brought that all in. I think it's wonderful, if I may. I think this record is perfectly tracked. That's always been a big thing for me, and I do dramatic narratives of every song in the book, is how a record plays out. And I love a good opener, which this record has, Detroit Rock City, with the whole dramatic, the radio opening. And I love the fact that side one, back in the old record days, ends with something sweeping like Great Expectations, with this choir singing it over and over again. And then the second side opens up, bam, with Flaming Youth, getting you right back into that Kiss environment. And then it ends, beautifully, like I said, with that soundscape by Jay Messina. So I think this record, I always rate records, especially during that period when albums was the way to present your work orally or sonically, that it has a great opener. The side one ending is great. It kicks in beautifully in the second, and it just ends very mysteriously. So that's how I kind of see albums and how they're presented. That also makes it the reason why I rate this one very, very highly.
Okay, I'm going to finish up with 3 quick questions here. You give me just short answers on this. I'll give you 2 real quick here. What's your favorite song on Destroyer? What's the best song on Destroyer?
Detroit Rock City is the best song that Kiss ever did, ever recorded. It's the best sounding song. It's the best driving song, perhaps ever written and recorded. I love that middle part. Love the opening, the driving ostinato. There's everything about that song is excellent. The answer to both those questions is Detroit Rock City.
And I'll finish up with this one. Is Kiss, as I've seen, I can't tell you how many times written, is Kiss the greatest rock band ever?
No.
No! Who is? Go ahead, who is?
Hard rock? You're talking about hard rock or rock and roll? The greatest rock and roll band of all time are the Rolling Stones, period.
Oh, you think so? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, if I may, just for a second, the Rolling Stones span 3 decades in which, at the beginning, they're a blues band. Then they become a pop band. Then they dabble in psychedelia. They write wonderful ballads like Ruby Tuesday, which you would never expect for them. Then they get into a period of darkness, the late 60s, where they really just reflect the entire turmoil of the time, assassinations and war and upheaval in France and in England, Street Fighting Man, Sympathy for the Devil. Then they sort of transfer into this beautiful country rock, funk, blues. They take all of the great American, especially the African-American sensibilities, and they recreate it for a whole new generation. Then they become the biggest thing ever and change the way tours are done. Where do I put Kiss in that? I would say that Kiss is arguably one of the top, and I get a lot of junk for this, but I'm going to put them in the top 5 of 70s bands. A different period than the Stones, certainly, or the Beatles. And a lot of people will kick me to the curb for not saying the Beatles, certainly. But since the Beatles only toured for like 3 years, you could argue that the greatest recording band of all time are the Beatles. But the Stones, I think, eclipsed them in the grander scheme for a longer period. But I would put Kiss in the top 5 of great 70s bands. I'll say that.
Well, James, when you write your Rolling Stones book, you going to call me back?
This is all I'm saying about the Rolling Stones, Joe. That's it.
All right.
I did want to ask you, though, before you get... Can I ask you a question?
Of course, sure.
So seeing how this is rock school, and
yes.
Seeing how you are a professor...
Yes.
And I assume you talk a lot about the recording techniques of different periods and music. How does my book speak to you in that sense? I mean, I thought it was great that you said, I asked if I was an academic, so at least I moved into that category, because I wanted there to be keys and song. I wanted each song to be really dissected and deconstructed. I use that word a lot. So I ask you, how does this, I mean, did it speak to you in that way? And as a professor, how would you recommend this book to, say, students or other people that are studying that period?
Oh, I think people who are fans of not only music, because you get a lot of people who will listen to songs on their telephones, those who only care if the music is in MP3, as long as I can hear it enough that it's in my head that I can recognize the song. Those people won't be interested in this kind of a book. But when you get people who are true music fans, who when they heard that Bowie died today, they will go and they will, collect a record of his. They will become the true audiophiles, will enjoy this book immensely, because to me, music is past the idea of it's something that fills space. Music to me is a communication between you and your soul. So when you take an album and you dissect it to the point of this is how every track was laid down and this is the story behind it. I love taking an album and doing that. I do it with a Christmas album every year on the show. A student of music should learn albums that really move them to this nth degree, and anybody who's at all a Kiss fan, or at all a hard rock fan, or at all a pop fan, because I really believe Kiss is a pop band. Kiss is a pop band that's got a hard edge to it. The idea of taking music and knocking it down so that it's not just a song that fills 3 minutes and 30 seconds, it is really a piece of art that took a person's soul and moved it to a piece of vinyl. And you'll never understand that unless you take it from the idea to the construction to the promotion to when it got to your ear. And that's what your book does. And I think that's what people have to understand.
Well, thank you, Joseph. And I would like to add that, and I don't know how far you go back. I'm 53 now, so I grew up in that period. And I never underestimate the imagination of kids. I never underestimate what music and art can do. My second book is called Fear No Art, and I always loved that. I plucked that from a piece of art from the 1980s in New York. I remember seeing it spray painted on the side of a building, and it always stuck with me. This idea that any sort of art form should never be considered lowbrow or highbrow, or just because it's not in a museum or because it's not recorded or it's not in the Library of Congress, that it has no worth. And I also feel that rock music, which is why I think the whole idea of a Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is a joke, it should be about rebellion, and it should be about delinquency, and it should be about changing the narrative, challenging the mores, the society in which it's created. So I've never, and I just recently wrote for my publisher, Backbeat Books, a long-form piece on the history of shock rock. And I was saying, well, everything in rock, Elvis Presley's your first shock rocker. Here's a guy who looked like he was dropped from another planet. Especially in the 1950s. And all of that's tethered together. It's a long line of chronology. And I think the great thing about Kiss, and specifically Destroyer, is I loved going back, and if I may end with David Bowie, since he did pass today, is that Bowie saw the humor in everything. He saw the way we can open the minds of young people to a different plane. And he played with people's perceptions of not only the music, but his own persona, painting himself and changing himself almost with every record. And I think Kiss was the lineage of that. And they woke my imagination. And that's why meeting Bob Ezrin and talking to these guys and talking to everybody who created this stuff, as you said, how the origins of this happen, I think is eminently fascinating, whether you just listen to MP3s now or you're 15 years old now or you're 53. I think it's very important that stays in the music. And since this is called Rock School, I'm very glad you mentioned that, and I thank you for your praise. But I think that's the most important thing is, does the piece of work expand? Does it spark your imagination and make you want to create too, or at least make you want to learn more about it? And it made me spend 3 years of my life writing about Destroyer. So thank you very much for your time, Joe. These questions were great, and I liked reliving the process with you.
Well, James, it was a hell of a book. I really enjoyed it. Once again, James Campion, it's spelled like champion, drop the H. The book is called Shout It Out Loud, the story of Kiss's Destroyer and the making of an American icon. I urge you to go buy it. Can it be downloaded, Kindle?
Yeah, it's available in all formats, as they say, and
Superb.
wherever good books are sold.
Wherever books are sold. James, thank you for your time.
Professor, it has been an honor, sir.